Hey you guys, my name is Fred Osling. I'm going to be doing a presentation on ASD today, and this is going to be an overview of the characteristics of ASD. So let's begin. So what is ASD? ASD is a developmental disability. It is characterized by social difficulties, communicative difficulties, repeated actions, and restricted repetitive behavior. It consists of these behavioral, social, cognitive, and neurological characteristics, linguistic characteristics. Some students, children, and adults with ASD are nonverbal, and it can also be characterized by severe cognitive and intellectual impairment. And ASD has a strong genetic component, which means that while in terms of analyzing etiology, we don't know, we can't define a basic cause of ASD that we can point at that and say, hey, that's what causes autism. There is a strong genetic component and a prevalence of genetic abnormalities, specifically in the copy number variant section of genetic study, uh, that that has been linked to the causation of autism. So while we don't know much about this, the etiology of autism, because it is a very complex field, we can definitely say that there is a strong genetic component, and with that comes a lot of further study to be done, because a lot of things affect our genetics. So, moving on. So, to begin with, we're going to be talking about the cognitive and neurological characteristics of ASD. So, some of the cognitive characteristics I want to talk about today are restricted theory of mind, weak executive function, weak central coherence, and the fact that many might present with an intellectual disability. So, restricted theory of mind refers to the idea that we ascribe thoughts, feelings, beliefs, emotions, etc. to other people. We ascribe a reality to people based on our theory of their mind, and we do this with ourselves as well. This is the cornerstone of forming relationships with people and kind of seeing what they're about. So people with autism have a restricted theory of mind, both with themselves and with others. And this is from birth. So this might manifest, at least in high functioning autistics, as cold, emotionless behavior, highly logical thinking, an inability to kind of pick up on and see and respond to emotional cues and the emotions of others in a way that we would typically subconsciously look for. And maybe in lower functioning autistics and across the spectrum, honestly, restricted theory of mind can be described by people who are neurotypical and maybe don't understand what restricted theory of mind is as selfish behavior, as coming from a place of selfishness. And I've actually even heard certain parents of kids with ASD in moments of frustration describe their child's behavior as selfish, despite it actually being arising from their kid being on the spectrum and having a restricted theory of mind. So the next characteristic I'd like to talk about is weak executive function. So executive function refers to higher order thinking as it pertains to judgment, behavior regulation, etc. And this is something that is attributed basically to the frontal lobe. So all those frontal lobe type functions, they are what comprise executive function. Now, weak executive function can manifest in a number of ways, and I think one of the most prevalent ways is that of the adherence to routine, because part of executive function is, behaving within a context, being in new contexts, and forming and executing behaviors in those contexts that are appropriate to the context, and just being able to think on one's feet and regulate themselves in that way. Now, because of this weak executive function, restrictive behaviors, restrictive routines are typically favored by people on the spectrum, and there is a markedly lower ability to plan ahead and show flexibility. So the next characteristic I'd like to talk about now is weak central coherence. Now, central coherence refers to the ability to see something as a whole, Now, parts of objects, small details, are, are typically things that people with ASD will show an interest and a proficiency and aptitude in for detecting and understanding. But the whole is something that might not be as coherent to them. So this is what's referred to as weak central coherence. And the final characteristic that I'd like to talk about is the fact that many might present with intellectual disability. Now, in the fall, this is something that is attributed basically to the frontal lobe. So all those frontal lobe type functions, uh, they are what comprise executive function. Now, weak executive function can manifest in a number of ways, and I think one of the most prevalent ways is that of the adherence to routine, because part of executive function is, behaving within a context, being in new contexts, and forming and executing behaviors in those contexts that are appropriate to the context, and just being able to think on one's feet and regulate themselves in that way. Now, because of this weak executive function, restrictive behaviors, restrictive routines are typically favored by people on the spectrum, and there is a markedly lower ability to plan ahead and show flexibility. So the next characteristic I'd like to talk about now is weak central coherence. Now, central coherence refers to the ability to see something as a whole. Now, parts of objects, small details, are typically things that people with ASD will show an interest and a proficiency and aptitude in for detecting and understanding. But the whole is something that might not be as coherent to them. So this is what's referred to as weak central coherence. And the final characteristic that I'd like to talk about is the fact that many might present with intellectual disability. Now, in the following slide, I'm going to be talking about statistics as they relate to IQ and the different sort of IQ brackets that people with ASD might fall into based on percentage-wise. So if we begin to look at the statistics of children with ASD, we can begin to form a better understanding of what ASD is, and an understanding that can actually allow us to help our students with ASD more and in a better fashion. So 31% of children with ASD have an intellectual disability. That means an IQ of less than 70. 25% are in the borderline range, which means an IQ of 71 to 85. And 44% of IQ scores in the average to above average range, which means an IQ of greater than 85. So autism doesn't actually necessitate an intellectual disability. So what that is giving rise to is the idea that being autistic is actually being differently abled. And we've actually seen this in terms of the kind of strengths that many with ASD show and the kinds of talents that they show in terms of, we've seen people with eidetic memory, an increased aptitude for logical and mathematical tasks, an increased aptitude for engineering and systems. So all this points to autism as a different ability or a different way of being. So now we're going to talk about the behavioral and sensory characteristics of autism. So some of the main behavioral characteristics of autism are self-stimulatory behavior. This can be really anything: flapping hands, hopping from one foot to another, bellowing, touching things, chewing on a chewy. For example, there are stimulatory tools and toys that can be bought for kids with autism to use for their stimulatory behavior, so that they potentially, maybe don't harm themselves, and maybe direct their stimulatory energy into something that is safer and potentially less harmful than some other behaviors that they might be engaging in. Restrictive repetitive behaviors. This can include an adherence to impractical or non-essential routines, such as taking a specific way home and from school and insisting on that way every day. Potentially self-harmful behavior. This can include, examples that I've seen personally have included hitting one's head on the table, or kicking hard objects and stuff like that. Generally, I've seen this in terms of coming from a place of being unable to communicate a need, or otherwise communicate to an adult in charge about something and instead resorting to this behavior. Uh, another manifestation of this that I have seen is potentially aggressive behavior, which again sometimes comes from the inability to communicate needs. And this is, I mean, I've seen this manifest as kicking, biting, threatening, cursing, screaming, meltdowns, outbursts, etc. So the sensory characteristics of autism can be represented by either a fluctuation by either hyper or hyposensitivity, and a fluctuation between the two in many cases. So what that means is that a kid with ASD is not necessarily hyper or hyposensitive in any given sense, including sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell. This is also represented by a difficulty with sensory combinations, that is, perceiving different senses at once. And part of this is, for example, looking and talking to someone, to visually process someone's, especially social cues, to visually process how someone looks when they're talking to you, and listening to them at the same time is difficult for people with ASD. And typically you'll see people with ASD kind of looking away so that they can listen better, because that's the directive, is to listen to what the person is saying. So people with ASD can also be hit with sensory overload, and this is typically manifested by outbursts, meltdowns, other forms of negative or aggressive behavior, because they don't know what to do with all of this. They don't understand what's going on. Their brain is being overloaded. Pica might arise as a result of hyposensitive taste, meaning undersensitive taste, and pica basically means to eat things that are non-edible. Stuff on the ground, rocks, I've seen happen before. I've seen kids chew on toys, etc. Textural discomfort. Now this is interesting, because different textures will create different types of discomfort given hyper or hyposensitivity. Rougher, more granular textures will, of course, spark hypersensitivity and create overload in people with hypersensitivity, while maybe smoother and more non-committal, I'd say, textures would cause discomfort or ambiguity in people with hyposensitivity. So again, this is everything in ASD is kind of a spectrum. I mean, ASD itself is a spectrum, and especially in the sensory realm, this is all on a spectrum. There are different degrees to which these phenomena happen, and they are sometimes represented as a fluctuation between hyper and hypo. So the last one I want to talk about is painful or uncomfortable touch. Now touch is very ambiguous when we think about it as neurotypical people, but touch means a lot of things. It means deep touch, light touch, and these can be different for different people with ASD. Deep touch is typically enjoyed by people who have hyposensitivity to touch, lowered sensitivity, while deep touch would be extremely uncomfortable to people with hypersensitivity. So typically kids with hyposensitivity, as part of their ASD, would enjoy a heavy blanket, weighted blanket, the security and the deep touch and the pressure of that weight, while people with hypersensitivity would be unable to tolerate that. And another hallmark of having hypersensitivity as it relates to touch includes not liking things on the hands or the feet, or not enjoying certain textures on the skin, because that can cause pain or discomfort. Now I'm going to be talking a little bit about communication and ASD. So beginning with communication and language, it is estimated that 1/3 of people with ASD are nonverbal. And challenges in communication range from verbal to nonverbal skills. And some of these challenges include recognizing facial expressions. This is a big thing, because one of the big things that people who are neurotypical take for granted in communication situations and discussion is that of nonverbal facial cues, and the ability to interpret these on a subconscious level, and the ability to sort of form opinions about what one is saying, to understand hidden meanings, etc. All of these come from nonverbal cues, because I mean, if we were just looking at the words that someone was saying, everything would be taken for granted. If anyone's ever watched the movie The Invention of Lying, it's almost as if half of lying comes from the ability to understand and to communicate nonverbally as well as verbally. So this is also represented by challenges in recognizing cadence or tone, which is in a similar suite of challenges that we're describing here. Cadence and tone are very important and are things that neurotypicals also take for granted by and large, because these are things that we are just naturally wired to understand. Cadence, the way I'm speaking right now, is my cadence is one of delineating something of, I'm speaking in a cadence that is conducive to explanation. You know, the way I draw my words out, the rhythm of my speech is conducive to breaking something down, to illustrating a concept. And my tone is academic. My tone is not necessarily conversational. My tone is informal academic, and these are subtle contextual recognitions that people like you and I will again take for granted in our own lives, because we naturally are able to subconsciously recognize these things. But to be sort of blind to this this part of the communicational reality is something that many with ASD go through every day. And all of these may account for what is perceived as awkwardness with people on the spectrum, because challenges in this regard, of course, restrict communicative ability. They restrict the ability to connect, and they generally put people on edge, from what I've noticed in my personal experience, to show this kind of inability is something that people do pick up on subconsciously. And if they're not aware of ASD and, you know, the challenges that it presents to people on the spectrum, then they may be put off by the person they're talking to who's on the spectrum. So this is one of those things that necessitates awareness. It necessitates increased education and response, and interfacing and interacting with neurotypical people who are not members of the ASD education or research field, or are not, you know, don't have family with ASD, or are not in communities where there are people with ASD and that have necessitated them learning about ASD already. We need to be able to reach people who do not understand the challenges and the strengths as well of ASD. So finally, we're going to take a look at social characteristics as they relate to ASD. So some of the social characteristics that we're going to be looking at today as they relate to ASD are challenges responding to social cues. So basically, there's a lot of implied communication that goes on when 2, 3, 4 people are communicating. And regardless of how many people are communicating, typically in the more intimate situations is, you know, where some of these other traits will come into play. But social cues can appear in a group setting as well as on an individual one-to-one setting. And in either setting, but especially in a group setting, but in either setting, social cues present a challenge for people with ASD. These can range anywhere from implied meaning to leading questions to sort of double speak, sarcasm, humor, etc. So all of these present a challenge to people with ASD. There's also perceived awkwardness by many people with who are neurotypical when they're when they're speaking with someone who has ASD. This again, as we talked about before, could be attributed to maybe some of the sensory characteristics and the communicative characteristics of ASD, including being unable to look, you know, people in the eye because of sensory processing issues, wherein it's difficult to actually listen to what someone is saying while trying to process them visually. So a lot of these characteristics are actually interconnected as far as someone who doesn't understand autism and their perception of someone with autism. And it's important to note that research and education in this on this condition is something that has to really go into detail. You know, there's no such thing as casually educating someone on autism, in my opinion, because people have to know that what they're looking at is not just someone who has, like uh, restricted social skills. It's someone who is going through something that could be any number of things, including sensory overload. It could be an inability to respond to their social cues, to their facial expressions, to their cadence, to their tone. So it's important to know that there is a whole nuance to ASD, and that ASD is something that needs to be studied in depth. So part of these social characteristics also include difficulty with body language and implied meaning. Now, body language represents a large part of human communication. You know, how we're standing, are our arms crossed? Are we standing head on directly looking at someone, or kind of looking at them sidelong? All of these things kind of give people a window into what the other person is communicating, whether they want to say it or not. The sort of the kind of how they truly feel about something. So the idea of body language and implied meaning kind of go hand in hand, because this kind of implied nonverbal non-standard communication is something that people with ASD definitely have difficulty with, definitely have difficulty processing and understanding. And I think this has a lot to do with our next point, which is difficulty reflecting on others' points of view, which is attributed to a restricted theory of mind. And not being able to form a theory of mind with yourself and a theory of mind about others would make it difficult to understand what others are saying to you, and would make it difficult to process their body language and process what they're implying when they're saying things, based on what you know about them, and the way that you know them, your theory of their mind, so to speak. Another social characteristic is minimal eye contact. This could potentially be resulting, like I said before, from atypical sensory processing. For example, being unable to process auditory information while having to look at someone in the eye. And a difficulty initiating, facilitating, and terminating a conversation. Now, there is a rhythm to conversation that, again, many neurotypical people take for granted. And the initiation, the facilitation, and the termination of a conversation are usually very natural things that we go through with minimal sort of awkwardness and clunkiness, so to speak. Now, without this sort of sense of internal conversational rhythm, it can feel very awkward and intimidating to initiate a conversation, to continue a conversation, to have a reciprocal giving and taking conversation. All right, so that's my presentation. I want to thank you guys for watching. I am not the greatest at recording things or presenting. I generally get a little bit of anxiety when I'm doing this, and I tend to stutter and stumble over my words. And I did re-record a lot of these slides, but I'm also kind of pressed for time. So I appreciate you guys bearing with me and listening and responding to my presentation. Thank you. Have a good day.